All right, looks like I'm live. Hi everyone, my name's Marissa. I'm going to be reading from Ain't I a Woman by Bell Hooks today. And I started reading a lot of Black feminist thought books, I think starting about a couple years ago. I was more interested in learning more about my experience in society and all of the stereotypical tropes that we encounter just existing, and just wanting to have a better understanding of that. Wave to people. And Bell Hooks, I think, was a great starter. She taught me a lot, and I feel like she has this book also, Feminism is for Everyone, and that was a great just starter Black feminist thought book. I'm going to read her quick foreword for this book, which does give it a good kind of overall telling of what it's about. And I'll be taking plenty of sips of water. I have a sore throat and dry mouth, so sorry for if it's difficult to understand me. Okay, so a classic work of feminist scholarship, Ain't I a Woman has become a must-read for all those interested in the nature of Black womanhood. Examining the impact of sexism on Black women during slavery, the devaluation of Black womanhood, Black male sexism, racism among feminists, and the Black women's involvement with feminism, Hooks attempts to move us beyond racist and sexist assumptions. The result is nothing short of a groundbreaking, giving this book a critical place on every feminist scholar's bookshelf. A cultural critic and an intellectual and a feminist writer, Bell Hooks is best known for classic books including Feminist Theory, Bone Black, All About Love, Rock My Soul, Belonging, We Real Cool, Where We Stand, Teaching to Transgress, Teaching Community, Outlaw Culture, and Real to Real. Hooks is Distinguished Professor in Residence in Appalachian Studies at Berea College and resides in her home state of Kentucky. So I'm going to start with Racism and Feminism. It's chapter 4, The Issue of Accountability. And I think this chapter really goes into depth about the intertwining of just being a Black woman and how that's played out in the feminist movement, especially with white women. American women of all races are socialized to, sorry, let me just start that again. American women of all races are socialized to think of racism solely in the context of race hatred, specifically in the case of Black and white people. The term racism is usually seen as synonymous with discrimination or prejudice against Black people by white people. For most women, the first knowledge of racism as institutionalized oppression is engendered either by direct personal experience or through information gleaned from conversations, books, televisions, or movies. Consequently, the American woman's understanding of racism as a political tool of colonialism and imperialism is severely limited. To experience the pain of race hatred or to witness that pain is not to understand its origin, evolution, or impact on world history. The inability of American women to understand racism in the context of American politics is not due to any inherent deficiency in women's psyche. It merely reflects the extent of our victimization. No history books used in public schools informed us about racial imperialism. Instead, we were given romantic knowledge about the New World, the American dream, America as the great melting pot where all races came together as one. We were taught that Columbus discovered America, that Indians were scalp hunters, killers of innocent women and children, that Black people were enslaved because of the biblical curse of Ham, that God himself had decreed they would be hewers of wood, tillers of the field, and bringers of water. No one talked of Africa as the cradle of civilization, of the African and Asian people who came to America before Columbus. No one mentioned mass murders of Native Americans as genocide or the rape of Native American and African women as terrorism. No one discussed slavery as a foundation for the growth of capitalism. No one described the forced breeding of white wives to increase the white population as sexist oppression. I am a Black woman. I attended all Black public schools. I grew up in the South where all around me was the fact of racial discrimination, hatred, and forced segregation. Yet my education as to the politics of race in American society was not that different from that of white female students I met in integrated high schools, in college, or in various women's groups. The majority of us understood racism as a social evil perpetuated by prejudiced white people that could be overcome through bonding between black and liberal whites, through militant protest, changing of laws, or racial integration. Higher education institutions did nothing to increase our limited understanding of racism as a political ideology. Instead, professors systemically denied us truth, teaching us to accept racial polarity in the form of white supremacy and sexual polarity in the form of male dominance. American women have been socialized, even brainwashed, to accept a version of American history that was created to uphold and maintain racial imperialism in the form of white supremacy and sexual imperialism in the form of patriarchy. One measure of success of such indoctrination is that we perpetuate both consciously and unconsciously the very evils that oppress us. I am certain that the black female sixth grade teacher who taught us history, who taught us to identify with the American government, who loved those students who could best recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag, was not aware of the contradiction. That we should love this government that segregated us, that failed to send schools with all black students supplies that went to schools with only white pupils. Unknowingly, she implanted in our psyches a seed of racial imperialism that would keep us forever in bondage. For how does one overthrow, challenge, or even challenge a system that you have been taught to admire, to love, to believe in? Her innocence does not change the reality that she was teaching black children to embrace the very system that oppressed us, that she encouraged us to support it, to stand in awe of it, to die for it. And I want to pause here and also mention, I feel like this chapter is very relevant to the conversations happening right now surrounding critical race theory and the GOP wanting to ban just the true history of this country and prevent public schools and colleges across the nation from teaching the true history that was already touched on in this chapter about the truth about the genocide of Native Americans in this country, the enslavement of black people. And I think it's important that that history is taught and understood. I'm not going to go off on too long of a tangent about that, but it's frustrating and it's very disappointing that loving this country has to be equated with just blind loyalty and a disregard of what the reality of our history is here and how it still impacts us today. All right. That American women, irrespective of their education, economic status, or racial identification, have undergone years of sexist and racist identification, have undergone years of sexist and racist socialization that has taught us to blindly trust our knowledge of history and its effect on present reality, even though that knowledge has been formed and shaped by an oppressive system, is nowhere more evident than in the recent feminist movement. The group of college-educated white middle and upper-class women who come together to organize a women's movement brought a new energy to the concept of women's rights in America. They were not merely advocating social equality with men, they demanded a transformation of society, a revolution, a change in the American social structure. Yet, as they attempted to take feminism beyond the realm of radical rhetoric and into the realm of American life, they revealed that they had not changed, had not undone the sexist and racist brainwashing that had taught them to regard women unlike themselves as others. Consequently, the sisterhood they talked about has not become a reality, and the women's movement they envisioned would have a transformative effect on American culture has not emerged. Instead, the hierarchical pattern of race and sex relationships already established in American society merely took a different form under feminism. The form of women being classed as an oppressed group under affirmative action programs further perpetuating the myth that the social status of all women in America is the same. The form of women's studies programs being established with all white faculty teaching literature, almost exclusively by white women, about white women, and frequently from racist perspectives, the form of white women writing books that purport to be about the experience of American women when in fact they concentrate solely on the experience of white women. And finally, the form of the endless argument and debate as to whether or not racism was a feminist issue. I'm going to pause there. If the white women who organized the contemporary movement toward feminism were at all remotely aware of racial politics in American history, they would have known that overcoming barriers that separate women from one another would entail confronting the reality of racism, and not just racism as a general evil in society, but the race hatred they might harbor in their own psyches. Despite the predominance of patriarchal rule in American society, America was colonized on a racially imperialistic base and not on a sexually imperialistic base. No degree of patriarchal bonding between white male colonizers and Native American men overshadowed white racial imperialism. Racism took precedence over sexual alliances in both the white world's interaction with Native Americans and African Americans, just as racism overshadowed any bonding between Black women and white women on the basis of sex. Tunisian writer Albert Memmi emphasizes in The Colonizer and the Colonized the impact of racism as a tool of imperialism. Racism appears not as an incidental detail, but as a consubstantial part of colonialism. It is the highest expression of the colonial system and one of the most significant features of the colonialist. Not only does it establish a fundamental discrimination between colonizer and colonized, a sine qua non of colonial life, but it also lays the foundation for the immutability of this life. While those feminists who argue that sexual imperialism is more endemic to all societies than racial imperialism are probably correct, American society is one in which racial imperialism supersedes sexual imperialism. In America, the social status of Black and white women have never been the same. In 19th and early 20th century America, few, if any, similarities could be found between life experiences of the two female groups. Although they were both subject to sexist victimization, as victims of racism, Black women were subjected to oppressions no white woman was forced to endure. In fact, white racial imperialism granted all white women, however victimized by sexist oppression they might be, the right to assume the role of oppressor in relationships to Black women and Black men. From the onset of the contemporary move toward feminist revolution, white female organizers attempted to minimize their position in the racial caste hierarchy of American society. In their efforts to disassociate themselves from white men, to deny connections based on shared racial caste, white women involved in the move toward feminism have charged that racism is endemic to white male patriarchy and have argued that they cannot be held responsible for racist oppression. Commenting on the issue of white female accountability in her essay, Disloyal to Civilization, Feminism, Racism, and Xenophobia, radical feminist Adrienne Rich contends, if Black and white feminists are going to speak of female accountability, I believe the word racism must be seized, grasped in our bare hands, ripped out of the sterile and defensive consciousness in which it so often grows, and translated so that it can yield new insights for our lives and our movement. An analysis that places the guilt for active domination, physical and institutional violence, and the justifications embedded in myth and language on white women not only compounds false consciousness, it also allows us to deny or neglect the charged connection among Black and white women from the historical conditions of slavery on, and it impedes in any real discussion of women's instrumentality in a system which oppresses all women, and in which hatred of women is also embedded in myth, folklore, and language. No reader of Rich's essay could doubt that she is concerned that women who are committed to feminism work to overcome barriers that separate Black and white women. However, she fails to understand that, from a Black female perspective, if white women are denying the existence of Black women, writing feminist scholarship as if Black women are not a part of the collective group, American women, or discriminating against Black women, then it matters less that North America was colonized by white patriarchal men who institutionalize racially imperialistic social order than that white women who purport to be feminists support and actively perpetuate anti-Black racism. To Black women, the issue is not whether white women are more or less racist than white men, but that they are racist. If women are committed to feminist revolution, be they black or white, are to achieve any understanding of the charged connections between white women and black women, we must first be willing to examine women's relationship to society, to race, and to American culture as it is, and not as we would ideally have it be. That means confronting the reality of white female racism. Sexist discrimination has prevented white women from assuming the dominant role and perpetuation of white racial imperialism, but it has not prevented white women from absorbing, supporting, and advocating racist ideology or acting individually as racist oppressors in various spheres of American life. And pause there. And I think with this passage, you can also just look back on history. Everyone always talks about Emmett Till. A white woman got this little boy murdered and lynched. And that behavior still, goes on today. Like now we have the quote unquote Karen videos and a lot of white women weaponizing their whiteness and leveraging their power in ways that are harmful to black women. And those be the same women that call themselves feminists and supporters of black women. Every women's movement in America from its earliest origin to the present day has been built on a racist foundation, a fact which in no way invalidates feminism as a political ideology. The racial apartheid social structure that characterized 19th and early 20th century American life was mirrored in the women's rights movement. The first white women's rights advocate were never seeking social equality for all women, they were seeking social equality for white women. Because many 19th century white women's rights advocates were also active in the abolitionist movement, it is often also assumed that they were anti-racist. Historiographers, and especially recent feminist writing, have created a version of American history in which white women's rights advocates are presented as champions of oppressed black people. This fierce romanticism has informed most studies of the abolitionist movement. In contemporary times, there is a general tendency to equate abolitionism with a repudiation of racism. In actuality, most white abolitionists, male and female, through vehement and their anti-slavery protests, were totally opposed to granting social equality to black people. Joel Koval, in his study White Racism, A Psychohistory, emphasizes that the actual aim of the reform movement, so nobly and bravely begun, was not liberation of the black, but the fortification of the white, conscience in all. It is a commonly accepted belief that white female reformists' empathy with the oppressed black slave, coupled with her recognition that she was powerless to end slavery, led to the development of a feminist consciousness and a feminist revolt. Contemporary historiographers, and in particular white female scholars, accept the theory that the white women's rights advocates' feelings of solidarity with black slaves were an indication that they were anti-racist and were supportive of social equality of all blacks. It is this glorification of the role white women played that leads Adrienne Rich to assert, it is important for white feminists to remember that despite lack of constitutional citizenship, educational deprivation, economic bondage to men, laws and customs forbidding women to speak in public or to disobey fathers, husbands, and brothers, our white four-sisters have, in Lillian Smith's words, repeatedly been disloyal to civilization and have smelled death in the word segregation, often defying patriarchy for the first time, not on their own behalf, but for the sake of black men, women, and children. We have a strong anti-racist female tradition despite all efforts by the white patriarchy to polarize its creature objects, creating dichotomies of privilege and caste, skin color and age, and condition of servitude. There is little historical evidence to document Rich's assertion that white women as a collective group or white women's rights advocates are part of an anti-racist tradition. When white women reformers in the 1830s chose to work for free to free the slave, they were motivated by religious sentiment. They attacked slavery, not racism. The basis of their attack was moral reform. That they were not demanding social equality for black people is an indication that they remained committed to white racist supremacy despite their anti-slavery work. While they strongly advocated an end to slavery, they never advocated a change in the racial hierarchy that allowed their caste status to be higher than that of black women or men. In fact, they wanted that hierarchy to be maintained Consequently, the white women's rights movement, which had a lukewarm beginning in earlier reform activities, emerged in full force in the wake of efforts to gain rights for Black people, precisely because white women wanted to see no change in the social status of Blacks until they were assured that their demands for more rights were met. And I think we still see this today, where it's like through the performative allyship, like white people that say that they are anti-racist and that they're supporting like getting rid of anything that's preventing equality in this country, it ends up just with a lot of performative actions instead of like substantial actions. So I think that is something good to think about. White women's rights advocates and abolitionist Abby Kelly's comment, "We have good cause to be grateful to the slave for the benefit we have received to ourselves in working for him. In striving to strike his irons off, we found most surely that we were manacled ourselves," is often quoted by scholars as evidence that white women became conscious of their limited rights as they worked to end slavery. Despite popular 19th century rhetoric, the notion that white women had to learn from their efforts to free the slave of their own limited rights is simply erroneous. No 19th century white woman could grow to maturity without an awareness of institutionalized sexism. White women did learn via their efforts to free the slave that white men were willing to advocate rights for Blacks while denouncing rights for women. As a result of negative reaction to their reform activity and public effort to curtail and prevent their anti-slavery work, they were forced to acknowledge that without outspoken demands for equal rights with white men, they might ultimately be lumped in the same social categories with Blacks. Or even worse, Black men might gain a higher social status than theirs. It did not enhance the cause of oppressed Black slaves for white women to make synonymous their plight and the plight of the slave. Despite Abby Kelly's dramatic statement, there was very little, if any, similarity between the day-to-day life experience of white women and the day-to-day experiences of the Black slave. Theoretically, the white woman's legal status under patriarchy may have been that of property, but she was in no way subjected to the dehumanization and brutal oppression that was the lot of the slave. When white reformers made synonymous the impact of sexism on their lives, they were not revealing an awareness of or a sensitivity to the slave's lot. They were simply appropriating the horror of the slave experience to enhance their own cause. The fact that the majority of white women reformers did not feel political solidarity with Black people was made evident in the conflict over the vote. When it appeared that white men might grant Black men the right to vote while leaving white women disenfranchised, white suffragists did not respond as a group by demanding that all women and men deserve the right to vote. They simply expressed anger and outrage that white men were more committed to maintaining sexual hierarchies than racial hierarchies in the political arena. Ardent white women's rights advocates like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had never before argued for women's rights on a racially imperialistic platform, expressed outrage that inferior niggers should be granted the vote while superior white women remain disenfranchised. Stanton argued, if Saxon men have legislated thus for their own mothers, wives, and daughters, what can we hope for at the hands of Chinese, Indians, and Africans? I protest against disenfranchisement of another man of any race or clime until the daughters of Jefferson, Hancock, and Adams are crowned with their rights. White suffragists felt that white men were insulting white womanhood by refusing to grant them privileges that were being granted to Black men. They admonished white men not for their sexism, but for their willingness to allow sexism to overshadow racial alliances. Stanton, along with other white women's rights supporters, did not want to see Blacks enslaved, but neither did she wish to see the status of Black people improved while the status of white women remained the same. At the beginning of the 20th century, white women's suffragists were eager to advance their own cause at the expense of Black people. In 1903, at the National American Women's Suffrage Convention held in New Orleans, a Southern suffragist urged the enfranchisement of white women on the grounds that it would ensure immediate and durable white supremacy. Historian Rosalind Terburg Penn discusses white female support of white supremacy in her essay Discrimination Against Afro-American Women in the Women's Movement, 1830 through 1920. As early as the 1890s, Susan B. Anthony realized the potential to the women's suffrage cause in wooing Southern white women. She chose expedience over loyalty and justice when she asked veteran feminist supporter Frederick Douglass to not attend the National American Women's Suffrage Association convention scheduled in Atlanta. During the National American Women's Suffrage Association meeting of 1903 in New Orleans, the Times Democrat assailed the association because of its negative attitude on the question of black women and the suffrage for them. In a prepared statement signed by Susan B. Anthony, Carrie C. Catt, Anna Howard Shaw, Kate N. Gordon, Alice Stone Blackwell, Harriet Taylor Upton, Laura Clay, and Mary Cogshell, the Board of Officers, the NAWSA, endorsed the organization's states' rights position, which was tantamount to an endorsement of white supremacy in most states, particularly in the South. Racism within the women's rights movement did not emerge simply as a response to the issue of suffrage. It was a dominant force in all reform groups with white female members. Terburg Penn contends discrimination against Afro-American women reformers was the rule rather than the exception with the women's rights movement from 1830s to 1920. Although white feminist Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and some others encouraged black women to join the struggle against sexism during the 19th century, antebellum reformers who were involved with women's abolitionist groups as well as women's rights organizations actively discriminated against black women. In their efforts to prove that solidarity existed between 19th century black and white female reformers, contemporary women activists often cite the presence of Sojourner Truth at the women's rights conventions to support their argument that white female suffragists were anti-racist. But on every occasion Sojourner Truth spoke, groups of white women protested. In the Betrayal de Negro, Rayford Logan writes, "When the general foundation of women's clubs was faced with the question of the color line at the turn of the century, Southern clubs threatened to succeed. One of the first expressions of adamant opposition to the admission of colored clubs was disclosed by the Chicago Tribune and the Examiner during the Great Festival of Fraternization at the Atlanta Exposition, the encampment of the GAR in Louisville, and the dedication of the Chickamauga battlefield. The Georgia Women's Press Club felt so strongly on the subject that members were in favor of withdrawing from the Federation if colored women were admitted there. Miss Corinne Stalker, a member of the managing board of the Georgia Women's Press Club and one of the editors of the Atlanta Journal, stated on September 19th, "In this matter, the Southern women are not narrow-minded or bigoted, but they simply cannot recognize the colored women socially. And at the same time, we feel that the South is the colored woman's best friend." Southern white women's club members were most vehement in their opposition to black women joining their ranks, but Northern white women also supported racial segregation. The issue of whether black women would be able to participate in the women's club movement on an equal footing with white women came to a head in Milwaukee at the General Federation of Women's Clubs conferences when the question was raised as to whether black feminist Mary Church Terrell, then president of the National Association of Colored Women, would be allowed to offer greetings, and whether Josephine Ruffin, who represented the black organization the New Era Club, would be recognized. In both cases, white women's racism carried the day. In an interview in the Chicago Tribune, the president of the Federation, Mrs. Lowe, was asked to comment on the refusal to acknowledge black female participants like Josephine Ruffin, and she responded, "Mrs. Ruffin belongs among her own people. Among them, she would be a leader and could do much good, but among us, she can create nothing but trouble." Rayford Logan comments on the fact that white women like Mrs. Lowe had no objection to black women trying to improve their lot. They simply felt that racial apartheid should be maintained. And I want to go back to that, but among us, she can create nothing but trouble, because that is, I think, an idea that carries on a lot in racial conversations, and when you have someone who is marginalized or underrepresented in a white dominant community, and they bring up any of the oppression that they're experiencing, have it be microaggressions comments that are made that are supposed to be jokes but are actually offensive, they end up being turned into that person that's the troublemaker instead of, the predominant group listening to what they're saying. It just highlights an unwillingness to change in some cases. So, writing of Mrs. Lowe's attitude toward Black women, Logan comments, Mrs. Lowe had assisted in establishing kindergartens for colored children in the South, and the colored women in charge of them were all her good friends. She associated with them in a business way, but of course they would not think of sitting beside her at a convention. Negroes were a race by themselves, and among themselves they can accomplish much, assisted by us and by the Federation, which is ever ready to do all in its power to help them. If Mrs. Ruffin were the cultured lady everyone says she is, she would put her education and her talents to good uses as a colored woman among colored women. Anti-Black feelings among white female club members were much stronger than anti-Black sentiment among white male club members. One white male wrote a letter to the Chicago Tribune in which he stated, "Here we have the spectacle of educated, refined, and Christian women who have been protesting and laboring for years against the unjust discrimination practiced against them by men, now getting together, and the first shot out of their reticules is fired at one of their own, because she is Black. No other reason or pretense of reason." And not to say that, white men are absolved of also carrying the same sentiments against Black men. Prejudices white women activists felt toward Black women were far more intense than their prejudices towards Black men. As Rosalind Penn states in her essay, Black men were more accepted in white reform circles than Black women. Negative attitudes towards Black women were the result of prevailing racist, sexist stereotypes that portrayed Black women as morally impure. Many white women felt that their status as ladies would be undermined were they to associate with Black women. No such moral stigma was attached to Black men. Black male leaders like Frederick Douglass, James Forten, Henry Garnett, and others were occasionally welcome in white social circles. White women activists who would not have considered dining in the company of Black women welcomed individual Black men to their family tables. Given white fear of amalgamation between the races and the history of white male sexual lust for Black females, we cannot rule out the possibility that white women were reluctant to acknowledge Black women socially for fear of sexual competition. In general, white women did not wish to associate with Black women because they did not want to be contaminated by morally impure creatures. White women saw Black women as a direct threat to their social standing for how they could be idealized as virtuous, goddess-like creatures if they associated with Black women who were seen by the white public as licentious and immoral. In her speech to the 1895 delegates from Black Women's Club, Josephine Ruffin told her audience that the reason white women club members did not want to join with Black women was because of the supposed Black female immorality, and she urged them to protest the perpetuation of negative stereotypes about Black womanhood. All over America, there is to be found a large and growing class of earnest, intelligent, progressive colored women who, if not leading full, useful lives, are only waiting for the opportunity to do so. Many of them still warped and cramped for lack of opportunity, not only to do more, but to be more. And yet, if an estimate of the colored women of America is called for, the inevitable reply, glibly given, is, for the most part, ignorant and amoral, some exceptions, of course, but those don't count. Too long we have been silent under unjust and unholy charges. Year after year, Southern women have protested against the admission of colored women into any national organization on the ground of the immorality of these women. And because all refutation has only been tried by individual work, the charge has never been crushed, as it could and should have been at first. It is to break this silence, not by noisy protestation of what we are not, but by a dignified showing of what we are and hope to become. We are impelled to take this step to make of this gathering an object lesson to the world. And I think it's interesting, and it's been said multiple times, where, groups of white people, it's all very, individual, but Black women are here being lumped together as being this one whole monolith of, immorality and impurity, and kind of just, disgusting, but I also enjoyed reading this passage because it highlighted even some of the experiences I've had in workplaces where I come off as intimidating to other people, and I think that these stereotypes definitely play into that and like how I've been perceived navigating the world. The racism white females felt toward Black women was as apparent in the work arena as it was in the women's rights movement and in the women's club movement. During the years between 1880 and World War I, white women's rights activists focused their attention on obtaining for women the right to work in various occupations. They saw work for pay as the way for women like themselves to escape economic dependence on white men. Robert Smutt, author of Women in Work in America, a work that would be more accurately titled White Women in Work in America, writes, "If a woman could support herself in honor, she could refuse to marry or stay married, except on her own terms. Thus, work was seen by many feminists as an actual or potential alternative to marriage, and consequently as an instrument for reforming the marriage relationship. The efforts of white women activists to expand employment opportunities for women were focused exclusively on improving the lot of white women workers who did not identify with Black women workers. In fact, the Black woman worker was seen as a threat to white female security. She represented more competition. Relationships between white and Black women workers were characterized by conflict. That conflict became more intense when Black women tried to enter the industrial labor force and were forced to confront racism. In 1919, a study of Black women in industry in New York City was published called A New Day for the Colored Woman Worker. The study began by stating, just a moment. For generations, colored women have been working in the fields of the South. They have been the domestic servants of both the South and the North, accepting the position of personal service open to them. Hard work and unpleasant work has been their lot, but they have been almost entirely excluded from our shops and factories. Tradition and race prejudice have played the largest part in their exclusion. The tardy development of the South and the failure of the colored woman to demand industrial opportunities have added further barriers. For these reasons, the colored women have not entered the ranks of the industrial army in the past. That they are doing so today cannot be disputed. War expediency, for a time at least, partially opened the door of the industry to them. Factories which had lost men to the war and white women to the war industries took on colored women in their places. The demand for more skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled labor had to be met. The existing immigrant labor supply had already been tapped and the flow of immigration stopped, and semi-skilled white workers were being forced up into the really skilled positions by the labor shortage. Cheap labor had to be recruited from somewhere. For the first time, employment bureaus and advertisement inserted the word colored before the word wanted. Colored women, untried as yet, were available in large numbers. Black female workers who entered the industrial labor force worked in commercial laundries, food industries, and less skilled branches of the needle trades, like the lampshade industry, which depended heavily on the labor of Black women. Hostility between Black and white female workers was the norm. White women did not want to compete with Black women for jobs, nor did they want to work alongside Black women. To prevent white employers from hiring Black females, white female workers threatened to cease work. Often, white women workers would use complaints about Black women workers as a way of discouraging an employer from hiring them. White women employed by the federal government insisted that they be segregated from Black women. In many work situations, separate workrooms, washrooms, and showers were installed so that white women would not have to work or wash alongside Black women. The same argument white women club members used to explain their exclusion of Black women was presented by white women workers who claimed Black women were immoral, licentious, and insolent. They further argued that they needed the protection of segregation so that they would not catch Negro diseases. Some white women claimed to have seen Black women with vaginal diseases. In one instance, a white woman working in the office of the Recorder of Deeds, Maud B. Woodward, swore out an affidavit asserting that the same toilet is used by whites and Blacks, and some have said Blacks have been diseased, evidence therefore being very apparent that one Negro woman, Alexander, had been for years afflicted with a private disease, and for dread of using the toilet after her, some of the white girls are compelled to suffer mentally and physically. Competition between black and white women workers for jobs was usually decided in favor of white women. Often black women were forced to accept jobs that were considered too arduous or taxing for white women. In candy factories, black women not only wrapped and packed candy, they worked as bakers, and in this capacity were constantly lifting heavy trays from table to machine and from machine to table. They were doing loosening in tobacco factories, a process formerly done solely by men. Investigators for the New York City study reported colored women were found on processes that white women refused to perform. They were replacing boys at cleaning window shades, work with which necessitates constant standing and reaching. They were taking men's places in the dyeing of furs, highly objectionable and injurious work involving standing, reaching, the use of weighted brush, and ill-smelling dye. In a mattress factory, they were found replacing men at baling, working in pairs, wrapping 5 mattresses together and sewing them up ready for shipment. These women had to have been constantly and lift clumsy 160-pound bales. In racially segregated work situations, black women workers were usually paid a lower wage than white women workers. As there was little, if any, association between the two groups, black women did not always know of the disparity between their salaries and those of white women. Workers for the New York City study found that most employers refused to pay black women workers as much as white women for doing the same job. Throughout the trades, differences in the wages of the colored and white were unmistakable. While every other colored woman was receiving less than $10 a week, of the white workers, only 1 out of every 6 was so poorly paid. A great many employers justified the payment of a better wage to white women on the grounds of their greater speed. Foremen in the millinery factories, however, admitted that they paid the color workers less, even though they were more satisfactory than the white. This wage discrimination seems to have taken 3 forms. Employers have sometimes segregated the colored workers, keeping the wage scale of the colored departments lower than that of a similar department made up of white workers. A second method has been to deny the colored the opportunity of competing in piecework, as in the case of the colored pressers and the needle trades who were paid $10 a week on a time rate basis, while the white pressers averaged $12 a week at piecework. The third form of discrimination had been the frank refusal of employers to pay a colored woman as much as a white woman for a week's work. And I think that's still an issue today, and we still find those disparities between white women and black women, and white men and black women, and just between black people and white people still. As a group, white women workers wanted to maintain the racial hierarchy that granted them higher status in labor force than black women. Those white women who supported employment of black women in unskilled trades felt they should be denied access to skilled process. Their active support of institutionalized racism caused constant hostility between them and black women workers. To avoid uprising, many plants chose to hire either one race or the other. In plants where both groups were present, the conditions under which black women worked were much worse than those of white female workers. The refusal of white women to share dressing rooms, bathrooms, or lounge areas with black women often meant that black women were denied access to these comforts. In general, black women workers were continually abused because of the racist attitudes of white women workers and of the white working public as a whole. Researchers for the New York City study summed up their findings by making a plea that more consideration be given to black women workers in industry. It has been apparent throughout this discussion that the coming of the colored woman into our industries is not without its problems. She is doing work which the white woman is refusing to do, and at a wage which the white woman is refusing to accept. She replaced white women and men and colored men at a lower wage and is performing tasks which may easily prove to be detrimental to her health. She is making no more mistakes than are common to a new and inexperienced industrial worker, yet she has the greatest of all handicaps to overcome. What is the status of the colored woman in industry with the coming of peace? At the time of greatest need for production and the greatest labor shortage in the history of this country, colored women were the last to be employed. They were not called into industry until there was no other available labor supply. They did the most uninteresting work, the most menial work, and by far the most underpaid work. The American people will have to go very far in its treatment of the colored industrial woman to square itself with that democratic ideal of which it made so much during war. Relationships between white and black women were charged by tensions and conflict in the early part of the 20th century. The women's rights movement had not drawn black and white women close together. Instead, it exposed the fact that white women were not willing to relinquish their support of white supremacy to support the interest of all women. Racism in the women's rights movement and in the work arena was a constant reminder to black women of the distances that separated the two experiences, distances that white women did not want bridged. When the contemporary movement toward feminism began, white women organizers did not address the issue of conflict between black and white women. Their rhetoric of sisterhood and solidarity suggested that women in America were able to bond across both class and race boundaries, but no such coming together had actually occurred. The structure of contemporary women's movement was no different from that of the earlier women's rights movement. Like their predecessors, the white women who initiated the women's movement launched their efforts in the wake of the 60s Black liberation movement. As if history were repeating itself, they also began to make synonymous their social status and the social status of black people. And it was in the context of endless comparisons of the plight of women and blacks that they revealed their racism. In most cases, this racism was an unconscious, unacknowledged aspect of their thought suppressed by their narcissism. A narcissism which so blinded them that they would not admit two obvious facts. One, that in a capitalist, racist, imperialist state, there is no one social status women share as a collective group. And second, that the social status of white women in America has never been like that of black women or men. All right. When the women's movement began in the late 60s, it was evident that the white women who dominated the movement felt it was their movement, like their movement. That is the medium through which a white woman would voice her grievances to society. Not only did white women act as if feminist ideology existed solely to serve their own interests because they were able to draw public attention to feminist concerns, they were unwilling to acknowledge that non-white women were part of the collective group women in American society. They urged black women to join their movement, or in some cases, the women's movement, but in dialogues and writings, their attitudes towards black women were both racist and sexist. The racism did not assume the form of overt expressions of hatred, it was far more subtle. It took the form of simply ignoring the existence of black women or writing about them using common sexist and racist stereotypes. From Betty Friedman's The Feminine Mystique to Barbara Berg's The Remembered Gate, and onto more recent publications like Capitalist Patriarchy and the Case for Socialist Feminism, edited by Zilla Eisenstein. Most white female writers who considered themselves feminists revealed in their writing that they had been socialized to accept and perpetuate racist ideology. In most of their writing, the white American woman's experience is made synonymous with the American woman's experience. While it is in no way racist for any author to write a book exclusively about white women, it is fundamentally racist for books to be published that focus solely on the American white woman's experience, in which that experience is assumed to be the American woman's experience. For example, in the course of the research for this book, I sought to find information about the life of free and slave black women in colonial America. I saw listed in a bibliography Julia Cherry Spurl's work, Women's Life and Work in the Southern Colonies, which was first published in 1938 and then again in 1972. At the Sisterhood bookstore in Los Angeles, I found the book and read a blurb on the back, which had been written especially for the new edition. One of the classic works in American social history, Women's Life and Work in Southern Colonies, is the first comprehensive study of the daily life and status of women in Southern colonial America. Julia Cherry Spurl researched colonial newspapers, court records, and manuscripts, material of every kind, drawing on archives and libraries from Boston to Savannah. The resulting book, in the words of Arthur Schlesinger Sr., a model of research and exposition, an important contribution to America's social history to which students will constantly turn. The topics include women's function in the settlement of the colonies, their homes, domestic occupation, and social life, the aims and methods of their education, their role in government and business affairs outside of the home, and the manner in which they were regarded by law and by society in general. Out of a wealth of documentation, and often from the words of colonial people themselves, a vivid and surprising picture, one that had never been seen before, emerges of the many different aspects of these women's lives. I expected to find in Sproul's work information about various groups of women in American society. I found instead that it was another work solely about white women, and that both the title and blurb were misleading. A more accurate title would have been White Women's Life and Work in Southern Colonies. Certainly, if I or any other sent a manuscript to an American publisher that focused exclusively on the life and work of Black women in the South, also called Women's Life and Work in the Southern Colonies, the title would be automatically deemed misleading and unacceptable. The force that allows white feminist authors to make no reference to racial identity in their books about women that are in actuality about white women is the same one that would compel any author writing exclusively on Black women to refer explicitly to their racial identity. That force is racism. In a racially imperialist nation such as ours, it is the dominant race that reserves for itself the luxury of dismissing racial identity, while the oppressed race is made daily aware of their racial identity. It is the dominant race that can make it seem that their experience is representative. And it's 12:50, so I have to wrap up this reading. So I hope everyone enjoyed. Thanks for joining me today. If there's any questions, feel free to reach out to me or to the department. But otherwise, I'm going to log off of here. All right, thank you.